What would you do if the one fragile place your family had just begun to rebuild suddenly became the place where another disaster quietly revealed itself, and the man who had finally escaped one lifetime of pressure collapsed before your eyes on the very soil he believed would save him? The doctor did not leave the room after saying Uncle Dũng had only fainted from high blood pressure and exhaustion. He stopped at the door, turned back, and looked at Jack with the kind of hesitation that makes hope go cold. "We need a few more tests," he said. Some of his indicators are not normal. Everything in the room changed. A moment earlier, the fear had begun to loosen. Mrs. Ly had finally taken a full breath. Tu Tien had just lifted another spoonful of warm porridge toward Uncle Dung's lips. Jack had been standing at the bedside, telling himself that maybe, just maybe, this was only one hard afternoon and nothing more. But with that single sentence, the relief they had barely touched was pulled away again. Tu Tien's hand stopped in midair. "Mrs. Ly" looked at the doctor as if she had not heard him correctly. Jack did not move at all, because the worst kind of fear is not the fear that arrives with screaming, blood, or obvious tragedy. It is the quiet fear that enters after you thought the danger had passed. And Jack, who was already holding up a company that kept slipping further out of reach, suddenly understood that the one thing he had hoped would remain steady for a while, family might be entering another storm too. Only hours before, the day had not seemed like a day that could tilt so violently. Jack had still been carrying the fatigue of everything that came before. Too many losses packed too tightly together, too many decisions made under pressure, too many doors closing without warning. Anyone else might have collapsed under the weight of it all. But Jack kept standing, not because he was unhurt, and not because he believed he had plenty of strength left, but because he knew that if he let go now, there would be nothing left to hold. That was the state he had been living in when he helped Uncle Dũng buy back a piece of land and start again. It was not some grand rescue. It was not a miracle. It was a practical, difficult choice made by people who no longer had the luxury of dreaming in large, beautiful shapes. Uncle Dũng had spent enough years living under noise, tension, unfinished debts, and the kind of pressure that turns every meal bitter. So when the opportunity came to leave behind the city's weight and begin again on a smaller patch of land, he took it. He did not bring much with him. No expensive furniture, no valuables, no heavy luggage that suggested success had followed him there. What he carried instead was something quieter and far more precious, the possibility of breathing differently. The right to wake up in a place that did not immediately ask something painful from him. The land was simple. The house was modest. The garden was not yet fully planted. Fresh soil still lay in turned beds, waiting for seeds and patience. Some parts of the fence remained unfinished. A few tools leaned against the wall. A stack of wooden boards sat in one corner. Nothing looked polished. Nothing looked complete. Yet the place held a strange dignity because every mark on it came from effort. Uncle Dũng cleaned it himself, repaired what he could with his own hands, swept each small corner, adjusted the loose boards, cleared weeds, turned the soil, watered the first green shoots as though they were proof that life still wanted him. He did everything slowly, without noise, without performance, without pretending the work was easy. But step by step, the place began to change. And with it, so did he. From the outside, it looked like a small beginning. To Jack, it looked like a second chance. That mattered because Jack himself had no real chance to pause. While Uncle Dũng was reclaiming a simpler life, Jack was trying to keep his own life from collapsing entirely. He poured what little strength, money, and focus he still had into the company. He did not think in terms of comfort anymore. He thought in terms of survival. The company had become more than business. It was the last structure still standing between him and complete ruin. As long as it remained alive, even weakly, there was still a path forward. That was what he told himself. Reality gave him no sign that it agreed. The company did not recover, not slowly, not partially, not in any way that could comfort him. Days passed and nothing truly moved. No new projects came in. No delayed plans suddenly awakened. No contract arrived with the power to change direction. Everything felt suspended in a silence more punishing than open failure. The worst part was not the collapse itself. It was the hesitation around him. Former partners still answered sometimes, but their voices had changed. People who once spoke with confidence now spoke with caution. Meetings were postponed, promises became vaguer, calls became fewer. No one was cruel enough to say outright that they no longer trusted him. That would have been easier to face. Instead, they gave him the polite distance reserved for uncertain men and unstable futures. Jack understood exactly what it meant. In business, people do not fear weakness as much as they fear doubt. A man may recover from losses. A company may survive bad timing, but uncertainty drains faith from a room before anyone admits it. So pressure returned again, only this time it was heavier because it made no sound. Then one afternoon, when everything seemed too still, Jack and Mrs. Ly decided to visit Uncle Dung. It was not meant to be a serious visit. There was no emergency, no formal purpose. Mrs. Ly simply wanted to see how he was settling in. Jack wanted, perhaps without fully admitting it, to spend an hour inside a place where life still looked rebuildable. When they arrived, the new home stood quietly in front of them. It was not large, it had no luxurious details, but there was warmth there. Beds of newly turned earth stretched beside the house. A few empty plots waited to be planted. The scent of fresh soil lingered in the air. Even the unfinished parts gave off something hopeful because they showed that hands had been working, that effort was still alive in that place. For a brief second, Jack felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not full peace, not healing, but the outline of it. Then he stepped through the doorway and stopped. Nothing obvious had happened. No crash, no cry for help, no visible damage. Just silence. Too much silence. He called out, not loudly at first. "Uncle?" No answer. Mrs. Ly looked around the small room, then back at Jack. A second passed, then another. The quiet no longer felt restful. It felt wrong. Jack called again, sharper this time. Still nothing. Without needing to discuss it, both of them moved toward the back garden where Uncle Dung usually worked. Their footsteps quickened over the uneven ground. The air that had felt peaceful a moment earlier now seemed to tighten around them. Then they saw him. Uncle Dung was lying motionless near the unfinished beds, one arm twisted awkwardly beside him, sweat soaking through his shirt into the dirt beneath his body. His face had lost all color. The tools nearby lay where they had fallen, as if his body had simply stopped before the rest of him understood what was happening. Mrs. Ly gasped his name. Jack was already running. He dropped to his knees in the soil and reached for Uncle Dung's shoulder. "Uncle, can you hear me?" No response. Jack checked for breath with hands that looked steady only because fear had made them rigid. There was breathing, weak, but there. Enough to keep panic from becoming total, not enough to calm him. "We have to move now," he said. Mrs. Ly was shaking, but she did not freeze. Between the two of them, clumsy with urgency, they lifted Uncle Dung and hurried him to the car. No one wasted time asking why. No one asked whether it might be nothing. Some moments strip people down to one thought only: keep him alive. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. Jack gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers ached. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, but his mind kept jumping back to the image in the garden. Mrs. Ly sat in the back seat supporting Uncle Dung, calling his name again and again in a voice that trembled more each time. By the time they reached the hospital, all three of them seemed to be breathing from the same frightened silence. Doctors took Uncle Dung in immediately. The emergency room doors closed. And then came the waiting. Jack sat forward with his hands clasped. Mrs. Ly remained beside him, quiet, rigid, and pale. Neither wanted to say the fears moving through them out loud. In hospitals, people often remain silent not because they have nothing to say, but because speaking would make worry more real. When the doctor finally came out, both of them stood at once. The first explanation seemed simple enough. High blood pressure, physical overexertion, too much heavy work over too many days without allowing the body time to adjust, cleaning, repairing, digging, carrying, gardening. Uncle Dũng had pushed himself too hard, and his body had answered by collapsing. Jack exhaled. It was a real diagnosis, a serious warning, but it was not the disaster his mind had already begun constructing. For a few minutes, that was enough. After treatment, Uncle Dũng slowly regained consciousness. His eyes opened with effort, but he was alert. When he saw Jack and Mrs. Ly beside him, he gave them a faint smile, the kind older people often use when they are still trying to protect others from their fear. "It's okay," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a quiet sadness, because everyone in the room knew they were not fully true. Jack said nothing. Mrs. Ly turned her face slightly away and wiped at one eye before anyone could notice too clearly. Then Jack took out his phone and called Tu Tien. His voice softened at once. "Can you cook some porridge and bring it to the hospital for Uncle Dũng?" He did not explain much. He did not need to. On the other end, Tu Tien did not ask unnecessary questions. "Yes," she said. "I'll come now." That answer carried its own kind of love. No panic, no demand for detail, just immediate movement toward care. When Tu Tien arrived with the still warm porridge, the room changed again, but this time in a gentler way. She stepped inside quickly, saw Uncle Dũng awake, and let out a breath she had clearly been holding since the call. Then she sat beside him, scooped one spoonful after another, cooled each one softly, and fed him with the quiet patience of someone who understands that tenderness can stabilize a room as effectively as medicine. No one said much. They did not need to. There was warmth there now. A familiar warmth. The kind created when worry, labor, and affection settle into the same space and begin holding each other up. For the first time that day, the hospital room felt less like a place of threat and more like a place where family had gathered around weakness without shame. That was when the doctor returned. Not hurried this time, not relaxed either. He stood near the foot of the bed with a careful expression, glanced once at Uncle Dung's chart, then at Jack. A brief silence passed before he spoke. "We need to run a few more tests," he said. "There are some indicators that are not normal." The air in the room seemed to drop. Tu Tien's hand stopped with the spoon halfway raised. Mrs. Ly's fingers tightened over the edge of the chair. Jack stood perfectly still, but something in his face hardened. No one asked a question immediately. That was the strangest part. The words were not dramatic, yet they struck harder than shouting would have, because once again, certainty had been removed. Once again, the ground beneath them shifted just when they had begun to trust it. The doctor explained only what he had to. A few concerning results, more observation, additional testing, time needed before anything definitive could be said. Time, that was the cruelest word, because while waiting, the mind invents futures faster than the body can endure them. Jack lowered his head slightly. Just hours earlier, he had told himself this was only exhaustion. Now he understood that relief had arrived too early. There might still be another problem hidden beneath the surface, another burden preparing to attach itself to a family already carrying too much. Tu Tien looked from the untouched bowl in her hand to Uncle Dung's tired face. Mrs. Ly stared at the floor, and Uncle Dũng, perhaps understanding more than he let on, remained unusually quiet. Outside that room, Jack's company was still bleeding strength. No new projects, no real recovery, no clear rescue. Inside that room, family had become another fragile front he might be required to defend. Work on one side, family on the other. Neither could be dropped, and that is where the true weight of Jack's life now stood, not in one dramatic tragedy, but in two silent pressures closing in at the same time, each demanding strength he was no longer sure he possessed. Still, there was one thing he could see clearly. Tu Tien remained there. She had come without delay, sat without complaint, cared without performance. In moments when fear could have made everything harder, she made the room gentler instead. Jack noticed that even while the doctor spoke, even while new uncertainty spread through the room, her presence did not tremble. It steadied others before herself. That steadiness mattered more than anyone said aloud, because sometimes the person who keeps a man from collapsing is not the one who solves his problems, but the one who stays beside him while no solution exists. Nothing was resolved that day. The tests had not yet answered anything. Uncle Dung's condition was no longer simple enough to dismiss. Jack's business troubles had not eased at all. Mrs. Ly still carried her worry in silence. And Tu Tien, though calm on the outside, understood as well as anyone that the hardest chapter often begins not with catastrophe, but with uncertainty. What would the next test results show? Was this only a warning brought on by overwork, or the first sign of something deeper? Would Jack have enough strength to keep carrying both family and business without dropping one of them? And would Tu Tien's quiet devotion continue to be the one thing that kept the people around her from breaking under the pressure of what was still to come? No one in that room had the answers yet. They only had waiting. And sometimes, waiting is the most difficult trial of all, because it demands endurance before truth, faith before proof, and calm before the heart has any reason to trust tomorrow.